LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, your memory sucks, but you can make it better. Here's how. The year is 2003, and Brian Williams, the straight-out-of-central casting news anchor, is in the Middle East covering the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq. Brian, tell us about what you got yourself into.
We asked the U.S. Army to take us on an air mission with them. They accepted. We knew there was risk involved. We knew we would be flying over Iraq. We discussed it. We weren't cavalier about it. We took off, and that is right about when things started to happen.
Williams is in a convoy of 4 Chinook helicopters tasked with delivering bridge components to a drop site about 100 miles south of Baghdad. It's a routine mission until...
Suddenly, without knowing why, we learn we've been ordered to land in the desert. On the ground, we learned the Chinook ahead of us was almost blown out of the sky.
So to recap, Williams is flying along when another helicopter, miles away, is hit by a rocket-propelled grenade. That helicopter makes an emergency landing, and about an hour later, when the copter that Williams is on catches up, it lands too. But here's how we told the story exactly 10 years later on Late Night with David Letterman.
2 of our 4 helicopters were hit by ground fire, including the one I was in.
No kidding.
RPG and AK-47.
What happens the minute everybody realizes you've been hit?
We figure out how to land safely, and we did. We landed very quickly and hard, and we put down, and we were stuck.
When Brian Williams told that patently exaggerated version of the story, he was at the top of his game. You probably remember what happened next.
This controversy threatens to tarnish the reputation of America's #1 news anchor.
He will not be in his anchor chair tomorrow. Will he ever sit in that chair again?
Why, Bri? Why, Bri lie?
Williams apologized, chalking it up to the fog of memory. But he was still suspended without pay, and although he did eventually make it back onto the air, he never returned to primetime. But in the years since, a few people have come to his defense. They buy his fog of war explanation. One of those defenders is my friend Malcolm Gladwell. He made an episode about the Brian Williams saga on his podcast, Revisionist History. Another is this man.
It's a very sad story, and I'm even more convinced after hearing that clip that it was a confabulation and probably inadvertent.
That's Charan Ranganath. He runs the Dynamic Memory Lab at UC Davis and is among the world's leading experts on human memory. The tragic tale of Brian Williams features prominently in his recent book, Why We Remember: Unlocking Memory's Power to Hold On to What Matters. Charan says the people who called for Williams' head on a spike, saying things like,
I think you would know if you were in a helicopter that was actually hit by a missile.
They fundamentally misunderstand how our memories work.
Basically, the act of remembering is an act of generating a story. When we recall bits and pieces, and he surely remembered the bits of being in the helicopter, the bits of the fear that he might have had at the time. Then he generates a story, and maybe in his story, the personal drama took charge over some of the other details that might have led him to disconfirm that story.
And this, by the way, can happen to anyone.
There are people who have been studied who have what's called highly superior autobiographical memory, where they can recall what they ate for breakfast 2 years ago. All these things that make you go, oh my God, they have a photographic memory. And you can stick them in a lab and make them generate the same false memories as anyone else.
Our susceptibility to confabulations is just one example of the ways our memories are imperfect. Add in all the other quirks and deficiencies that scientists like Charan are now uncovering, and well, it has major implications. Because our memories shape the narrative of our lives. They give us a sense of self. and oftentimes a sense of self-worth. We measure intelligence with Jeopardy and the SAT, games and tests that are essentially memory competitions. What would happen if we could all update our understanding of how our memories work and what they're for in the first place? For one thing, we could all forgive ourselves for not acing the potent potables category or getting double 800s. More importantly, we could improve our lives, find gratitude, be happier. We could all forgive Brian Williams. So today on the show, Charan and I are going to talk about what really happens in your brain when you remember something, why the name of that actor is stuck on the tip of your tongue, the problems with remembering too much, and what you can do right now to start improving your recall.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by HubSpot. Imagine growing a business with high-quality leads, fast-closing deals, and wildly happy customers. It's not a miracle, it's HubSpot. Visit HubSpot.com to get started today.
Just imagine that I've said all kinds of wonderful, flattering things about you in the intro. Just you're beaming with the afterglow of all my flattery here. Here we go.
Awesome! I'm already glowing.
Charan Ranganath, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you very much, Rufus. I'm so excited to be here.
Charan, you are a neuroscientist with deep expertise in memory. Would you describe yourself as having a good memory?
Oh, no. Quite the opposite. There's a saying among scientists, or actually researchers in general, which is that you study what you're not good at. They call it me search, and that's definitely describes me.
Do you ever walk in a room and forget why you're there?
Oh, yeah. I may, in the course of this conversation, forget what we were talking about if I just let myself think of email for a second.
This is reassuring. How about with names? I mean, for me, what's really daunting is the school mixers with all the other parents. Mm-hmm. I appear to have outsourced the remembering of the names of other parents to my wife, who she remembers all of them. I remember very few.
Mm-hmm. I'm terrible with names too. And I'm terrible with faces. Like, I will see someone who I've seen before and be like, no idea. And I guess let me backtrack and just say, the course of writing this book, a lot of it was self-therapy. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I really came to appreciate is, despite the fact that I say I have a bad memory, my wife and daughter would say I have a bad memory, people around me might say that, I never struggled in school, and I don't struggle to remember. There's certain things that I just do fine with. And so I think that we're still struggling to figure out a lot of what makes your ability to learn different than mine. I just think there's a lot of open questions about it. But I definitely think that, my mind works in a particular way, and I just have to accept it and work around it in some ways.
See, I find this so fascinating. Ever since the last few weeks of reading your book, I've been talking with a lot of friends about this, that everyone seems to have some things they remember with great facility that just is easy for them to remember, some categories of things, and other categories that just, in my case, the information just flows through my brain like sand through a colander, right? When it comes to an example is the names of like cinematographers and producers and B actors in movies. I just don't retain that information at all, whereas my wife remembers all of it. So I sort of thought of myself as having a bad memory. Then my wife was like, well, Rufus, you talk for hours and hours and hours about books you find fascinating with incredible detail. Mm-hmm. And that sort of surprised me. And I was like, oh, I guess you're right. This category of things is easy for me to remember.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Typically, it comes down to a few factors. One is expertise. Once you build up a particular base of knowledge, it's easy to attach new things to it. Like, my guess is probably if you met like if you met me again or something like that, and we were at some next big idea conference or whatever, and I introduced you to my wife, you'd probably find it easier to remember her name because you have all of this prior knowledge about me and the book and our conversation that you can attach it to. It's one of the weird mysteries of memory that even something completely meaningless becomes easier to remember if you can attach it to something that you already know.
Right. And so if you have in your mind a whole taxonomy of information, like for my wife, she thinks of a cinematographer or producer and immediately thinks of the 12 other films they've done. That new piece of information she can attach to multiple other adjacent pieces of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And it just, do you think, is that why the expertise, why building expertise is easier than remembering things that are out of context?
Well, in general, the brain is just not really well equipped to remember things that have no meaning. And the other part of it is importance. It's not necessarily what's important in the sense of what society tells you is important. To some extent, it's what you feel is important. Right. And to some extent, it's what evolution shaped your brain into thinking is important.
This is a question that has gnawed at me, which is I see sometimes, that people are hurt when I don't remember their names. Mm-hmm. And I always make an effort to say, look, it's not you, it's me. Mm-hmm. Like I'm really bad at this. But they are clearly thinking, I'm noise for Rufus, not signal. Right? like he has not prioritized me as an important, or my name as an important piece of information. And consequently take a little bit of offense, which maybe is correct in the sense that, like, if I meet someone who's a billionaire who might invest in our company and accelerate the business, I'm probably not going to forget his or her name, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, there is some element of prioritization there. On the other hand, I care deeply about other people. I'm very curious. I'll often remember the conversation I had with that individual, but not their name, right? So, mm-hmm. so it's important to me that it's not a reflection of my not caring about these people on some level,
I want you to know this is the most common problem that people tell me about. Yeah. The most. Yeah. I talked to Terry Gross, I'm not dropping like a humble brag in there, but I talked to Terry Gross, who hosts the NPR show Fresh Air. And first thing she said is proper nouns. Why is this such a problem for me?
Right.
So for some people, it goes beyond faces and names to words in general. And again, you got this problem where there's something that's utterly meaningless, right? So you have a very unusual name, and it's unusual enough that it's kind of in this good spot where it's like, I've heard the name before. I mean, don't take this the wrong way, but my childhood best friend, he had a dog named Rufus. So it's like very memorable for me. But at the same time, there's nothing about your face that screams this name, right? Yeah. I would have to come up with some kind of association, like somehow associating you with my friend who had that dog or something like that, to be able to just see your face and have it be there. And so a lot of the easy way to pull up memories is if there's a cue in front of you that's like the key that allows you to access it, right? But on the other hand, if the key is just buried amidst this pile of other keys, then you're in bad shape, because memories compete with each other. And there's many faces that you see, many names that you encounter, and many times the same name is associated with different faces, and many similar faces are associated with different names. So it creates this huge competition, and competition is not great for memory. Yeah. What you want is one memory that just pops out of the rest. And so one of the tips that I give people to improve memory is to plant cues, which means that you don't have to look. There's something in the environment that will pull up a reminder of what you're looking for. So it could be some meaningful link. It could be just learning more about you and becoming more curious about your biography, which has some other benefits. It could be something along the lines of thinking of maybe a likely context in which I will see you next, or something that allows me to pull up this episodic memory, this memory for this unique point in time.
Well, you are welcome to use a Shaggy Dog mnemonic device for my name if you'd like to, Charan. I will tell you that I was barked at as a child by kids on the playground. It was character building to have a dog's name growing up. But all right, Charan, I'm going to play something for you. I'm curious to know what memories this triggers for you.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay, you know what that was?
Oh, yeah. That's the opening riff to Def Leppard's Photograph. That was one of the first records I really got into. I had a friend who bought that record, and so I remember sitting around listening to it.
And so I'm guessing that songs from your youth, and I think for many of us, right, and the lyrics of those songs are in the category of something we remember easily. And is that because of the emotional valence of those years of the adolescence was a critical time for us, or part of it perhaps is that music itself is easier to remember?
I think all of the above. So one thing is that we tend to go back more to the defining years, or what we see as the years that defined who we are. And those tend to be, at least in Western cultures, adolescence through early adulthood, like 13 to 30, around that time period. So they call it the reminiscence bump, just meaning if you plotted a little graph over time of how much people recall periods of their life, there's a bump right around that age. And so we do tend to call back those memories more. But also the songs we listen to from that period are often more tied to our sense of who we are and our tastes in music. Then you have the fact that music is arousing often, at least certain cases, like rock music tends to be arousing, and arousal tends to be emotionally evocative, and those factors are more likely to promote lasting memories.
Some of the frustration that we were expressing earlier about forgetting names and the faultiness of our memories, I have found to be quite widespread in my conversations with friends and colleagues in the last few weeks reading your book. I did a survey of some of these friends. 60 people responded. 42% said they were frustrated by a memory failure daily. 53% said occasionally. 5% said never. And I kind of suspect those three individuals were having memory failures about their memory failures.
Yes.
I don't know who never feels frustration. I mean, that's kind of remarkable. But if this were a customer satisfaction survey, I would say that is not a great review of our experience of our brains, right? I mean, there's kind of, I think, a widespread sense that like our brains are not working properly. We want a refund. Like something's wrong here. Should we not be frustrated? Are we asking the wrong things of our brains?
I would say that I understand the frustration, and I don't want to deny people the opportunity to be frustrated. But I would also say that, no, we're not expecting the right things of our brain. One way I like to think about it is, imagine if I went to your house, right? And let's say, I don't know what your house is like, but let's say it was clean and well organized and you had like beautiful furniture and artwork, but it wasn't like cluttered. It was just like a very kind of feng shui sort of thing, right? Or whatever. And I walked in, I'd say, God, this place is just so poorly organized. Why don't you just throw everything that you've ever experienced and throw it into this house, right? Why not just hoard? You're wasting so much of your stuff by throwing things away. And you'd look at someone like Marie Kondo and you'd say she's an idiot, right? And that's her expectation of memory, is that we should be hoarders. And
interesting.
If you really think it through, and keep in mind, as a memory researcher, I and most of my colleagues suffer from the same illusion. But it's like this idea that somehow it's good to hold on to everything. There's always trade-offs. The more you want to carry, the more clutter you have to sift through. And that's time consuming, and you can't find what you need when you need it. And if you look at the solutions for remembering, it doesn't come down to remembering more. It usually comes down to memorizing less.
So as you said, we have a bit of an expectation management problem here. Like, we would like our brains to be help us win at Jeopardy and perform well in the SATs and basically like flawlessly record the past, right? But as you say, it did not evolve for that purpose. And I'm at Evo, I'm just fascinated by evolutionary theory. And so I was very interested in your explanation of the purposes for which our memories evolved in our ancestral past. What did our memory capability evolve for?
I mean, I will say that there's many different kinds of memory capabilities that all interact in the real world and are connected but different. So it's extraordinarily hard to say there's one function. But in general, the most basic thing you can say is that memory, or all kinds of learning really, are designed to help us out with the present and the future.
Yeah.
And if we think about just the primordial mammal that we might have come from, right? So this mammal has survived for, let's say, 10 years or something like that, still in its years of reproductive capability, let's say. The only thing that matters is anything that's going to help it reproduce or protect its kin and allow the kin to reproduce and survive. Anything else that's happened is the past, and by definition, it's over. So the only things that this mammal needs are things that will help it in the present and things that will help it make the right choices to get it to the right places in the future. And that's basically the message of learning and memory. That's what it's about, is giving you the information from the past that you need to make predictions. And it could be something very simple, like, even very, very primitive animals can do conditioning, which is a cue that predicts something that's going to happen in the environment or in yourself. And then you have much more complicated things like being able to go, I'm not going to eat at that restaurant because the last time I did, I got charged way too much and I had a terrible meal.
Right. And there's also, I think, I remember you're describing how our episodic memories, and it could be useful to distinguish between semantic and episodic memories, that our episodic memories, which is memories of the narrative of our past, if I'm getting that right, were originally perhaps helpful in helping us remember where we are in space. I think you had this incredible anecdote about, was it seals or something that had that some of them had a disease that caused them to lose a certain kind of episodic memory capacity. And as a result, they were no longer able to hunt successfully to find the right feeding grounds. And they were washing up on shore dead because they starved to death. Right. So simply knowing where you are physically in space requires retaining the narrative of the journey that took you here. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. In the case of the sea lions, basically the shortest version of the story is that I had just had this enormously exciting opportunity where I hooked up with a young researcher who was doing research on these sea lions that would eat fish that binged on toxic algae, or they would binge on the fish. The fish ate toxic algae. And so you can imagine these toxins going up the food chain, and it caused damage to the hippocampus. It had this chemical called domoic acid, which is actually used in human studies or in animal studies to simulate epilepsy in rats. And so these animals had epilepsy, and they were very much like patients that we see in the clinic who have epilepsy. So they have memory problems. They would get lost. They wouldn't know where to find their food. They didn't know where they were, and they would just wash up on the beach like, where am I? And even after they got over the sickness part of it, they had this dense amnesia. And it was just this fascinating case of being able to see in the real world, in a non-human species, just how important that capability of episodic memory is for just grounding yourself in space and time.
Getting back to this notion of our forgetfulness, you refer at one point to the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, right? I think he was the first scientist to study, I guess, in himself, the pace at which he would forget things. And I think the conclusion, I guess it's stood the test of time, is that we forget roughly like 60% of what we experience or more in 24 hours. Is that directionally right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah. So that is the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. The actual number will differ according to the kind of information you're talking about. But on average, there's a steep amount of forgetting that happens within the first couple of days. And then what lasts after that will tend to last much longer. But there's a lot of forgetting that takes place very quickly. And in particular, those are the details of your experiences. You might remember what happened, but something that unfolded over the course of 2 hours all of a sudden becomes one sentence in your biography. It really becomes compressed, and there's a lot of detail that's lost.
And if we're losing, let's say, roughly 60, 70% every 24 hours, the question is it the right 60 or 70% that we're forgetting, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is maybe the piece we can have some influence over.
That's right. And I think this is the thing that comes with forgetfulness and aging. So much of that forgetfulness, in my opinion, is not necessarily a loss of plasticity. It's not like a shrinkage in your brain's ability to form memories per se. I think a good chunk of that variability is our ability to focus on the information that will allow us to remember what matters. And I think part of it is often we don't think about what matters in the first place. We don't put a lot of thought into what we want to remember. One of the big factors that promotes whether or not something will be memorable is whether or not you have focused on the distinctive elements of that experience that make it different from everything else.
I love this framing of people talk a lot about being present and being in the moment, but framing the objective as creating high quality memories that we would like to have, opposed to a lot of low quality half memories from a constant state of distraction, which is, of course, exacerbated by modern technologies, right? Isn't that a nice way to think about it? That like today, among other things I'm going to try to accomplish, I'm going to try to be very intentional about creating high quality memories.
Yes. I mean, that's exactly the message that I want people to get, is to be intentional. And maybe that high quality memory that you want to focus on is something that's work relevant. Maybe that high quality memory is something about being in the moment with one of your kids or one of your other loved ones and being able to remember the feelings that you had and being able to travel back to this unique moment in time and relive and be able to take this one experience and make it something that's the memory that's going to last a lifetime. I think having that intention is what will make it easier to direct your attention. And once you direct your attention to the right factors, you're going to have a better quality memory for the things that you want to remember.
We've got to take a quick break now. Charan and I will be back in a few. Would you like to be the most interesting person at your next cocktail party? Want to be the person who always has a great answer to the question, read any good books lately? Want to get smarter without cutting into your precious Netflix binge time? Well, allow me to introduce you to the Next Big Idea app. Our curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink, have handpicked hundreds of the best new books, and we've worked directly with the authors of those books to create 12-minute audio summaries. Unlike other book summary apps, these aren't written by side-hustling college students. They're written and read by the authors themselves. And that's not all you'll find once you download the app. We also have masterclasses from authors like Shankar Vedantam and Lisa Feldman Barrett, ad-free versions of this podcast, and exclusive author interviews you can't find anywhere else. There is no better way to get smart fast. Download the Next Big Idea app today by going to your app store and searching for Next Big Idea. One thing I found kind of encouraging in your book was this notion that our lack of ability to retrieve a memory is not necessarily an indication that we don't have the memory encoded, right? There's really two parts of the process. There's memory encoding and the storage of memories, and then there's the retrieval, right? And I think it's the prefrontal cortex that executes this process. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how the system works and where it breaks down?
Basically, we think memories are stored by coalitions of neurons that are highly connected with each other, so that if I activate a few neurons that were active during a past event, then in theory, those neurons will activate a lot of the neurons that they're highly connected with, and that will allow you to reconstruct fragments of the past experience that you had and give you that conscious feeling of remembering, right? But the key is getting back to that particular coalition of neurons. And to do that, you need to have some cue that is similar to the experience you originally had. In other words, it's a lot easier for me to remember you if I see you again than it is to remember your face if I'm just looking at a blank screen, right? So having these cues is super important, right? Now, sometimes the cues can be uniquely associated with a particular event, and those are the most potent cues. So we talked about music as an example.
Yeah.
Places can be another example. If there's a place that we've only been to once, the second time you go back there, like the second time I've gone to a particular airport in Latvia or something like that, I will pull up memories from that experience that I might not have had access to were I not in that airport. And so that's an interesting part of memory that I think even, again, in neuroscience, they don't necessarily appreciate enough, is this idea that often there are memories that are in there, but we lack the right cues to get them.
I was also fascinated to learn that our brains are designed to rewrite the same memories. I think you call it memory updating. And this can be frustrating or maybe lead to confusion, but it's again a feature, not a bug.
Yeah. In fact, if we go back to Ebbinghaus and his forgetting curve, one of the cool things about his studies is Ebbinghaus didn't measure forgetting by how much he couldn't remember from things that he tried to memorize. He actually measured it by how long it took him to re-memorize the same things. And so he found that if he had some degree of memory for the previous experience, he could relearn, rememorize everything faster, right? And so what's going on there? Well, what's going on is that you have some kind of degraded memory of this thing that you tried to memorize, and re-studying it, re-exposing yourself to it exposes that junky memory, but now you have an attempt to repair it and do better with it. And so that is this capability that we have of updating our memories. And it's a great thing. And sometimes you update your memories in, again, adaptive ways because the world changes, right? So you have a friend who you see once every 2 years. In theory, you would want to completely update your memory for that person's face based on the last time you saw them. You don't want to remember the face that this person had 20 years ago. You want to remember them at the most recent moment you saw them. And so we do update our memories for faces, but we probably don't update them enough. We kind of adopt this middle ground of updating somewhat, but not completely enough, if anything. The bad part of it, of course, is it means that we're victims of revisionist history very often. We'll tell stories and we start to embellish them, or other people give us some misinformation about what happened. And then next thing you know, our memory doesn't just reflect what happened, it reflects our last time we remembered what happened. And then the next time we recall that, now we have residue of the last 2 times we remembered. And so by the end of it, a memory of something that we've revisited many, many times has the residue of all the stuff that happened afterwards.
Yeah. And at some point, I mean, we all, I think, probably have certain stories from our lives. Like in a 4th grade swimming race, my bathing suit fell off in front of a very large crowd of people. I have told that story so many times, and other people have told that story back to me so many times that I don't think I have access to the original experience, right? I mean, I have maybe a little bit, I can see through the cracks of like the 500 times the story's been told, little glimpses of the actual original experience, but I think it's largely occluded by all the retellings. In the process of summoning memories, we recreate them and distort them to some degree.
Yeah, we present the event from a particular perspective and we generate a story about it. And now we have a memory of generating that story. then we have another memory of generating the story when we tell it to new people. And what happens is each time you do that, the original context and a lot of the original details start to fall off. And what you have left with is something that's a very general, vague story that could have been something you read in a book, because like you start to lose anything that's unique to one point in time. And again, that's good because it's like if you're trying to learn Spanish, and you're trying to pick up a vocabulary word, you don't want to go back and mentally time travel to for each time you studied that word. You want to just be able to pull it up and just have it be something that's accessible anywhere at any time. And so this ability to update our memories is also part of what helps us build knowledge.
I'm really interested in this question of the relationship between memory and intelligence. And I think it strikes me that maybe one of the reasons that we're also kind of embarrassed by memory failures is that it triggers insecurity, I think, for many people about intelligence. What do you think is the relationship between memory and intelligence?
I think that people overdo this idea of intelligence and memory because Einstein actually famously said, don't bother memorizing something that you can find in a book. The idea is it more intelligent to memorize everything, or is it more intelligent to know what's worth memorizing and to know what's not worth memorizing? And I think that's where some of the real intelligence comes from, is finding the information and focusing on the information that's most important to you.
Yeah. Now, to make your point further, one of my favorite Einstein quotes was, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will come up wanting or something, right? But the point being, everybody's a genius in their own way.
Yeah.
And the question is, if we measure with SAT, ACT tests, vocabulary, for instance, well, that happens to be an area of interest for some of us, not for others. Other people have encyclopedic knowledge of baseball scores or whatever interests them, right? Some of it's about interest. The other thing I found interesting theoretically is this notion that if words are units of thought, we can compress a concept or an idea into a single word. If we think in words, that knowing more words would help us think more efficiently, right? And kind of improve our computational system. Mm-hmm. So I can see some context within which if we think of memory and certain kinds of memory as kind of like RAM for a computer, the ability to call upon a certain number of concepts or ideas, facility with language, that maybe that does help improve our cognition. How do you think about that?
I think that there's a very important role for being able to reduce information to something that's manageable to work with. The human brain, as I say, it's all about economy. And so the way attention helps us is by taking this mammoth amount of information that we have at our disposal and reducing it into something that we can actually work with. That's what makes it hard to memorize a European phone number, because we just have this endless set of numbers that are grouped in a way that makes no sense to us, in America, that is, that makes no sense to us. And so it's just exceptionally hard to do that. But an American phone number is much easier because we know it's organized into 3 bits. There's an area code, then there's 3 digits, and then there's 4 digits. And that basically allows us to take 10 digits and reduce it down into 3 chunks, 3 bits of information. And that's what allows a grandmaster chess player to memorize an entire match that they would see, so they watch Gary Kasparov or whatever play some, match in chess, and they can reproduce move for move everything that happened, right? But it's also what allows, as I talk about in the book, one of my favorite examples of memory is seeing LeBron James talk about basketball games.
The start of the 4th, I think they cut it to 14. Do you have any idea what happened there?
What happened? We ran him the first possession. We ran him down all the way to 2 on the shot clock. Marcus Morris missed a jump shot, followed it up. They got a dunk. We came back down. We ran a set for Jordan Clarkson, and he came off and missed it. They rebounded it, and we came back on the defensive end, and we got a stop. They took it out on the sideline. Jason Tatum took the ball out, threw it to Marcus Smart in the short corner. He made a 3. We come back down, miss another shot. Tatum came down and went 94 feet, did a Euro step, and made a right-hand layup timeout. There you go.
I especially like it because it goes back to this point that you had about intelligence. And I think a lot of people have the stereotype somehow that athletes aren't intelligent. But I defy anyone to apply that to LeBron James, because it's whether you like him as a fan or not, it's just incredible to see somebody who's such a scholar of the game, who's able to take these complex sequences of events and reduce it both in memory when he can recite, entire, minutes of plays through and explain exactly who did what in extraordinary detail.
Right.
But he also sees that play out in real time. And so it's like, here's a person who's seeing what's happening now. They lock it into a pattern, and they lock it into that pattern that tells me not only how we've gotten to this point, but where we're likely to go. And that's true of a chess player. That's true of a professional basketball player. It's probably true of footballers. Wayne Gretzky was supposedly like this with hockey. And the best of those kind of high-speed athletes, they talk about how they can see things before they happen. And that's memory about the present and about the future.
This comparison of grandmaster chess players and LeBron James and the way he thinks about basketball is kind of fascinating because, as I understand it, a grandmaster knows that there's a certain relatively small number of good opening moves and good responses to that move, and so on and so on and so on. So the possibility sets are much smaller, and their patterns and relationships between pieces that they can chunk into a relatively small number of things to remember, right? Whereas for most of us watching that game, it looks wildly complex. Maybe in a similar way, for a sophisticated basketball player, they're remembering all the possible moves and relationship between players and the instincts of how to respond to the other team, and have an ability then to store that memory of exactly how that game played out and how what we've learned from that can be applied to playing the next game better. And that's why LeBron James is LeBron James, in part. It's not just physical prowess. It's the intellectual ability to learn to incrementally respond better on the court, right?
Yeah, and see the patterns and I think that's a marker of intelligence, is the ability to see the connections between things that happened 3 plays ago or 3 moves ago and what's happening now, and then see 3 moves ahead. And that time scale is something that humans have arguably a longer time scale of being able to find those connections than other animals do, for instance. But it's so important. And just to go back to this idea of misconceptions about memory, people talk about a photographic memory. But if you put chess pieces that are white and black and you use the same board, but they look like pieces that a chess player has never seen before, and you put them in places that these chess pieces shouldn't go, they're just as bad as somebody who's never played chess at memorizing these things, right? And then you can reverse engineer that and say, okay, so imagine that I could memorize anything that's on a chessboard that involves certain pieces. That's giving you a bunch of stuff that you can't use. And now you have all of these things that could be going on that are never going to play out in a real game of chess. And so why would you want that? Why would you want to have all these possibilities that could never happen? There's limits to what you want to memorize. It's like LeBron James wouldn't want to memorize a bunch of things that could never happen in a basketball game. It's like, why?
Yeah, exactly. We also see that that people with truly prodigious memories, like we all think, oh, I'd love to have a photographic memory and remember everything. A lot of people with truly prodigious memories are kind of dysfunctional.
Yeah. So there are interviews with people who have highly superior autobiographical memory. And one of the most common things you see is after you get past the kind of like, oh, it's so nice to be able to blah, 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 you get into rumination and things stick with them, especially the negative things. You can actually see this in LeBron too. He tends to remember this when he recalls these scenes in enormous detail. They're usually sequences of plays where everything went wrong. And so they replay these things in their heads over and over again. And you look at people with severely deficient autobiographical memory. One of my colleagues who actually came up with this term, he actually says, I'm one of these people. They tend to be much more in the moment. They tend to be much less burdened by things in the past.
Yeah. I was interested in remembering a Borges story I read many years ago called Foons the Memorious.
Yeah.
About a man who could remember everything. And it ends, Foons had effortlessly learned English, French, Portuguese, Latin. I suspect, however, that he was not very capable of thinking. And then I encountered in pulling that up an essay that Nietzsche, the philosopher, wrote on memory. He wrote, imagine the most extreme example, a human being who does not possess the power to forget, who is damned to see becoming everywhere. Such a human being would no longer believe in himself. He would see everything flow apart in turbulent particles and would lose himself in this stream of becoming. All action requires forgetting. Now, this was total speculation on Nietzsche's part, right? But it seems not that far from the truth that the process of forgetting and prioritizing our memories, selecting memories to prioritize, is part of our process of having an identity and understanding ourselves, right? I mean, we understand ourselves because we forget. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say that we understand ourselves because memory is so selective and because memory is reconstructed in the manner of stories. There's a lot more that we have to ourselves, though. One of the fascinating things in the study of memory that I was attuned to in writing the book is work by folks like Dan Schachter, who have looked at how memory or imagination can allow us to change our behavior and our view of ourselves. So if you recall a time when you've been altruistic, for instance, you will be more likely to feel like you should be altruistic in the present, right?
Yes.
So I think it's like we often underestimate the variability of who we are. And when we're feeling angry, we can think of ourselves as angry people. And when we're feeling like happy, we're going to think of ourselves as happy people. And a lot of that is access to these particular memories that open up a particular window of who we are. And so there's much more of a dynamic sense of self that we can have if we become attuned to it.
That's so powerful, right? That basically the memories that we choose to remember, and there is somewhat of a choice there, right? And that we tell ourselves stories about ourselves, and the stories that we summon and retell define the way we think about ourselves, and they also influence our future behavior, right? I mean, so there's some sense in which we are our memories to some degree.
Yeah, and you can become trapped by them. And that's what I say. And one of the things that I really like to say is memory is a resource. It should be the co-pilot, but you don't want to driving. You don't want to put it in the driver's seat. You want it to be your co-pilot. You want it to be your navigator. That's the big mistake I think that people make is they get caught in their own narratives. And also, you got to appreciate just how selective and how cue dependent memory is. And those are things that every memory researcher will tell you. And it sounds like nerdy lab talk, but it has very serious real world implications because I can think of myself as somebody who's like socially inept, but I can remember all of these times where people walked away being like, God, this person's so smooth and so forth. And that doesn't fit with this biography that I often pull up or the memories that I pull up of those experiences. But if I try hard enough, I can find them. And then it's like, oh, well, I'm not so bad. And that's why I also, when I can, and I don't do it enough, is I started to do a gratitude practice. And I don't do the gratitude practice for the sake of some kind of a spiritual thing or whatever. But for me, it's like, it's a useful tool to not say, what am I thankful for in general, but what are 2 or 3 episodic memories from the last 24, last 48 hours
Interesting.
that are positive.
Yeah.
They don't have to be important in any way, shape, or form. It could be that I was asked to do a podcast interview for somebody whose podcast I kind of like. It could be that I happened to have lunch at a place that I've never eaten at before, and it was great. It doesn't have to be important. What I find is remembering those things immediately squashes my pessimism, and it immediately gives me a new view of what my life is.
It's so interesting. I never thought of the gratitude practice as one that is effectively like a positive memory exercise. I mean, it's a memory creation or memory prioritization ritual that has this kind of like enduring impact. I mean, of course, all of us have a certain set of memories that we maybe would prefer not to remember, right? I mean, things that scarred us, things that were painful in our past, insults we received as a child. I find a lot of people, if you ask someone, can you remember any insults you received as a child? Probably a lot of people can. I remember I was in 9th grade on the soccer team, and some older kids were laughing and pointing at me, and then they said, do you realize that when you run, your head bobs around? Your head bounces when you run, Rufus? And I was a tall, gangly kid. I'm still kind of a tall, gangly kid. And I was just, totally embarrassed, right? And this was not a compliment. And to this day, I occasionally think like, is my head, when I'm running, is my head bouncing? But do you have any memories of insults you received as a child?
Oh my God, so many. But I also got the most unimaginative ones. I mean, it'd be like the biggest one was probably "Don't squeeze the Charan," which is based on the TV commercial. Don't squeeze the Charmin.
The Charmin, yes. That dates both of us, but I remember that commercial very well. Yeah,
ladies, you can't squeeze the Charmin.
But I can remember a lot of things that I've done that I regret. I can remember a Facebook comment that I made that I regret, and it's the most mundane, stupid thing, but it comes back to me. And that is one of my fatal flaws, is having these things that stick with you.
Yeah. I'm guessing most of us have a certain set of memories of things we're ashamed of, moments where we didn't rise to the occasion, we behaved badly, things we'd like to take back. Maybe some of those memories are useful, though, because they're sort of reminders not to behave in those ways, right? They're cautionary tales in our storytelling collection.
I feel like that's like one of the biggest elements of successful interventions like journaling or psychotherapy. When you express a memory that's shameful, you have to generate a story about it. And especially if I'm doing it in the context of therapy or a close friend or a family member who I really trust, that act of telling the story and sharing this shame fundamentally is now a new part of the experience, because now it's shaping my narrative. And especially if I share it with someone else and they reflect back on me their perspective. And if I can really listen to that perspective, now I've modified the memory a little bit more. And it becomes just like that story that you've told about, your swimming example, where it loses a lot of that original context and just becomes a story that can be looked at from many different ways and can be associated with many different things that are not associated with that original interpretation.
Right. No, I'm now a hero. 10-year-old Rufus, naked in the swimming pool, who won the swimming race, was a hero. Whereas, in fact, in the moment, I was probably just totally terrified and trying to, We both collaboratively, in communication with others and in conversations with ourselves, have the power to reframe those memories in ways that are not delusional. It's really just a matter of framing and perspective on a real memory.
And these social interactions are so powerful because, this is pure speculation, but you can see in the brain very clear signals that reflect our memories that we get from observing others, or at least you can see this in animals observing other animals, for instance, doing things, so forth. So this social interactions have a real power to affect memory in a particular way. And so I think we often underestimate the effect of our interactions with others are on our own memories, but also the effect of our interactions. I haven't really talked about this before, but the effect of our interactions on other people's memories. So parents, when they're interacting with children about children's memories, if you dismiss a child's memory, you're basically telling them that their view of their own past is fundamentally wrong and they shouldn't trust it. And essentially that is giving them this very amorphous sense of who they are because they can't trust themselves.
Right.
So that negation can be huge. And you can see this also in negation in, peer groups or negations amongst, families like at large, like siblings can do this and so forth. And you could see it at a larger level with kind of gaslighting of particular social problems that have happened in history or something like that. And just ignoring things that are just very, very real that have these enormous implications for everyone.
Right. And we can also probably help our children reframe their memories in slightly more useful or constructive ways.
And that's what I really found to be powerful in thinking about these topics is there's so much of a capability we have to reframe the stories of the past and approach our past from a different perspective. And what you can find is often if you can do it effectively, if you can change your view of how things happen, you can actually pull up different data than you did before.
We're going to take another quick break. Don't go anywhere, though, because when we come back, Charan will explain why your approach to learning is probably all wrong.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
You say something in the book that really surprised me, which is that effective learning needs to be difficult, right? And I think this affects how we should think about effectively preparing for a test or even learning in our field, in our chosen field. Why is it helpful for the learning process to be difficult?
One of the facts that comes up over and over again, if you look at learning across many trials, is that you learn the most when you stress test your memory the most each time. So, for instance, if I am trying to memorize some new words in a new language, we'll pick a different language like Mandarin Chinese, let's say, or something, right? Yeah. So I see some characters, I try to memorize them, and I'm like, okay, I got it. I've memorized them. Now I wait 1 week later and I try to memorize them again. I'm like, oh God, I have a vague memory for this character. I'm trying to pull it up, but I'm not. Now, what happens is that essentially you've exposed a weakness in your memory. This gives you all sorts of opportunities. One is that you just know, now I'm going to do better the next time around, and I'm going to focus on what I missed the first time around. But one factor that I believe is true too is when you pull up these memories in contexts that are very challenging, you end up exposing weaknesses in the memory that can then be fixed when you revise and update the memory. But if you never challenge yourself in the first place, you won't give yourself the opportunity to fix it, right? So struggling is really good because it gives us the most learning opportunity. It's why if you are testing yourself on something, you will memorize better than if you just study the same material over and over again. It's why if you test yourself even before you study, even before you could possibly know the right answer, you can get a benefit in memorizing. It's
Isn't that
nuts.
interesting? Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes those effects can be as big as testing yourself after. So you see the Chinese character, you try to take a guess for what this is. Let's say I tell you it's a noun. Try to guess it. You guess it. And then you get the actual answer. That can often help you memorize it more than if you just got that noun. That's what we call error-driven learning, is that you've generated the wrong answer. Your brain says, hey, you're given the feedback. Nope, this is the right answer. And now you can go, let me wipe out the parts of the memory that are associated with this wrong answer, that overlap with the wrong answer. Let me emphasize the parts that are uniquely associated with this correct answer. So when we have that moment of pulling up a memory that's not right or failing to pull it up altogether, that gives us a sense of cognitive conflict. It's actually, you can see it'll activate the anterior cingulate, which is a brain area that's associated with that sense of whether it's like cognitive conflict and not being able to remember something, or it could be, oh, I made a mistake, I pushed the wrong button, or it could be, I'm physically in pain right now. You could see activation, all those conditions.
Interesting.
Right? And so it's uncomfortable. But that's what you want. But if I'm an actor and I want to memorize lines for a play, I don't read the script over and over again. I act it out. If I want to learn how to get from point A to point B in this new city that I've moved to, I don't look at a map over and over again. I walk it or I drive it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's that act of actually doing it that stress tests your memory, because you're trying to pull it up and then you're faced with the reality that doesn't match, and your brain can now tweak it to better fit the reality. But if you never expose that weakness in the first place, you don't get it.
I love this because it gets back to this mythology of intelligence that we were talking about earlier, which is that we have this idea that if you're smart, things will come easily. Whereas the learning here from the data is actually learning needs to be difficult. It should be difficult. If it's difficult, it means you're doing it right, and you will retain those memories more effectively.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that can be as simple as trying to recall some information in different contexts. It can be as simple as spacing out the sessions, the number of times in which you try to memorize something. It can be like testing yourself. So one thing that you can do is you can test yourself on things that you need to remember, like names. You can test yourself on the names like about 1 minute after you've learn the name, and maybe you're still in the zone where if you fail that test, you can ask the person, hey, remind me of your name again. But you test yourself first, and now you've got the error that you've exposed, right?
And so we should embrace discomfort. We should be intentional with our attention, use mnemonic devices when necessary. And you also say that if we want to make our brains work better, we should make our bodies healthier, right? that people, I mean, I grew up with this sense that, well, they're the jocks who are really attentive to their physical athleticism, and then they're the brainy kids who totally ignore their bodies. But we now know that our bodies and brains are very tightly connected, and the health of our body and the health of our brain, our cognitive capabilities directly correlate, right?
I love hearing you say these talking points because you express them so perfectly. You've distilled it down to its essence. That's absolutely right. Your brain's a body part. Cognitive health is linked to your emotional health, and it's linked to your physical health. And the things that are good for your body and the things that are good for your emotional health will be good for memory.
Well, so as we come to the end of our time here, you mentioned earlier that we have a positivity bias when we look back at our memories. And I think you also say in the book that this positivity bias can lead us to feel a sense of nostalgia for the past, right? And that can sometimes be a lovely thing if we're having fond memories of our childhoods or whatever. But there are also some dangers to a sense of nostalgia that is exaggerated.
In fact, actually, the word nostalgia was coined by a Swiss physician who described it as a disease. So he was studying these soldiers who were just miserable. They probably had post-traumatic stress disorder, but one of the things that they talked about was how much they missed home, how much that their memories of how good things were at home made their present lives miserable. And so it all depends on how you use this information in memory. If you're aware of the fact that my memories of the past are selective, and every time I'm pulling up memories, it's a bias sample, then I can indulge in my memories of the past and let them make me happy. But if I see what I remember as the only part of what happened, then I can look at now and say everything used to be great and now it's terrible. And I mean, this is something that you see in people as they get older, is on average, people become more optimistic and more positive, and those two are related to each other.
Yeah.
But sometimes what happens is the positivity bias leads them to think when I was young, everything was great. And now that I'm old, it's terrible. And it's like, no, when you were young, you didn't know a lot of what you know now. And you were making all sorts of mistakes that you wouldn't make now and suffering for those mistakes. But you're not thinking of it because you've learned from it already. And the person who's remembering is remembering it from the perspective of somebody who's already learned from all those mistakes. And so these bias samples of the past can give us this illusory sense of how good things used to be. And if you look at every totalitarian regime that's ever happened, they weaponize this on a collective level. You go back to Hitler, of course, as kind of the canonical example of this, of how things used to be great. And then these outsiders came in and screwed everything up. Well, was Germany really so good? Does he even remember any of these things?
Right.
And it's not about the past. It's about skewing people's views of the present. And
Right.
that's where nostalgia can really hurt you.
Yes. And we're all susceptible because we have this positivity bias in as we look back at our memories. So collective positivity bias leads to collective nostalgia, leads potentially to make America great again.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, I remember America when I was growing up, it had problems, It had
Yeah,
a lot of
right,
problems.
exactly.
You can always find what you're looking for in the past and find evidence for it. And I think you need to be aware of just how incomplete those memories are.
We were talking earlier about memory updating. There's an opportunity for us to engage in collective memory updating, both as communities of friends, but more broadly as a nation, right? To sort of, we can look at the data and say, actually, America wasn't safer 40 years ago. Like that's not what the data shows. And if we can collectively update our memories, that can help us maybe have more appreciation for where we are and come up with more accurate solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, the marker of a great country is a country that learns from its mistakes and does better. And I think that's as somebody who's patriotic, I think that's like something Americans have tried to do. And it's part of our spirit is not being so stuck in tradition and this view of history that we can't innovate. But I think that's the tendency is for people to get stuck in this view of the past and not see it as a tool for learning. And I do feel like there's this discomfort that we have in encountering ideas that are different than our own, whether it's an idea of the past or it's an idea of the present. But those are where that's, again, the biggest opportunity for error-driven learning. That's where we learn the most.
Yeah.
And we learn the least from people who agree with us. We learn the least from reading the things that are going along with what we already thought. And so what happens is people just go on these incremental slides into mediocrity as opposed to allowing themselves to learn more and broaden. And that learning can come in all sorts of ways. It could come from reading a book that's outside of your area of normal, the kinds of books you read, or listening to music that's in a genre that's different than you normally do, or being around people who come from different places and have different lived experiences than you. But that's the source of imagination. That's the source of creativity. And that's what makes humans, I think, irrelevant in a world of AI where you don't have that capability of imagination because so much of it's homogenized.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love this idea of being intentional about the memories that we choose to make every day, both individually and collectively. I'm already experiencing pre-stalgia for this conversation, which I enjoyed so much. This will be a fond memory for me. And this book of yours, Why We Remember, is making a big impact. And hopefully that will cause you not to feel nostalgia, but a lot of positive feelings about your future.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's just been such a gift to be able to share this with the world and to have conversations like this. I really enjoyed it.
Charan Ranganath's new book, Why We Remember, is out now. Grab a copy at your favorite bookstore. How is your memory? Let's discuss on LinkedIn. Just search for me. Wait, what's my name? Oh yeah, Rufus Griscom on LinkedIn, and join the discussion under my post about this episode. I mentioned this last week. We just put together a list of the 44 most exciting new books coming out in June. We'd love to know which ones you think we should feature on this show. Which ones interest you most? Follow the link in the episode notes to vote now. Today's episode was written and produced by Caleb Bissinger. Sound designed by Mike Toda. Everyone at the LinkedIn Podcast Network has an impeccable memory. I'm sure of it. I'm Rufus Griscom, and I'll see you next week.